Hawthorn. My name's Kate Ray and I'm your host. And we've got a little bit of a different setup and a different feel this time. It's a new thing for me. We've got a new platform. So I want to thank Lee Bliss from Just Paranormal for allowing me to hop on the back of his, I want to say Duckyard. It's not Duckyard, it's StreamYard. I'm not doing the advertising very well for that bit there. The other new element to Hare and the Hawthorn is I have a co-host, which is super exciting for me. So we've got Neil Rushton. I don't know how it happened, but I've kind of dragged him along to talk all things fairy, and he is up there with the fairyologists of great height. So he is the experienced one, and I'm the hostess and the rambler. And I'm a little bit nervous about today, because not only have I got Neil with me, who, you know, makes things a bit nervous for me anyway, because I just sit back and shut up. But I've also got Dr. David Luke with us today. Again, I'm always astounded about when people go, yeah, I'll come on and chat to you, with you about fairies. And it's like, oh no, it's, we're in a big playing field now. But I know that this is going to be a really, really exciting interview. So I'm going to do a brief introduction to David. We've just been saying that if I was to introduce him on a massive scale, that we would be here all night going through all his achievements within academia and outside of that, as well as research projects, etc. So Dr. David Luke is a professor of psychology, and I hope I'm getting all this right, so correct me if I'm wrong. And one of the aspects that I'm particularly interested in is a senior lecturer for Centre of Psychedelic Research, which is kind of how I came across him on another interview with the very weird and wonderful Victor Wind, where I sat absolutely transfixed listening to psychedelic experiences and mushrooms, which is definitely my big thing. So I'm going to let David introduce himself and give us a bit of a round about who he is and why you may think he's here with us.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on board, Kate and Neil. Really great to spend some airtime with you both. I'm a big fan of Neil's work, although I haven't read it all, but I've seen he's written some amazing articles, and he seems to really know his stuff as well. So it's really great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. I guess I'm not sure why I'm here, really. I guess if you hang around these kind of spaces long enough, people begin to think you know something and invite you to come and talk. But yeah, I've been involved in the kind of academic study of kind of strange and wonderful experiences since the kind of start of my career, really, and did a degree in psychology, PhD in parapsychology, looking actually at kind of precognition and luck primarily, but I've always been interested in bizarre experiences, particularly those ensuing from those long gazes into the medicine bag that people have, when they've kind of maybe munched on a bit too much fungus or whatever it is. And little people, if we want to call them that, just to kind of not discriminate between all the various types, are quite common to those experiences. So that's what's kind of led me down the rabbit hole into the fairy ring, and why I'm here, I suppose. Is that good enough?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, one of the first questions that I always start off with people is, what is your personal belief outside of the academic studies? What is your personal belief with the fairies? Where are you coming from with that?
Well, I guess I'd have to kind of give you an hour-long answer to that one, which we'll probably kind of get to as we unpack it. But I try and remain agnostic, but also look at all the data. So, I try not to believe anything if I can, which is really hard work, actually. It's kind of like one of these kind of anti-beliefs in a way, which is hard to maintain. So I just try to go on the data and keep my mind open to all possibilities. And that includes, the possibility that little people may be real, self-existent, sentient entities that exist in some kind of ethereal realm beyond our normal material realm. So I'm also open to that idea. I haven't ruled it out, and there might be some good evidence to suggest that is also a very genuine possibility. So I'm just open to all of it, really.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of talking about data, I mean, me and Neil have chatted quite often about how you collate data and how you get evidence and then where you go and what you do with that evidence in terms of these paranormal experiences, especially when it's outside the normal paranormal research realms. So in terms of data, what is presenting to you, and at what point would you say that there is proof? That's a massive question, isn't it? At what point do you say that we now have the beginnings of proof of these things?
Okay, I'll try and unpack this. This will be a bit of a longer answer, but so I mean, I guess it depends in which kind of field of study you're situating your data, really. You know, is it kind of neuroscience? Is it psychology? Is it anthropology? Is it folkloric studies and mythology? And you'll get a different answer to those questions. I mean, I guess all of it generally probably comes under the heading of like ontology, you know, which is like the study of the nature of reality, or which is a branch of metaphysics, which is just really just kind of talking about these things. But I'm interested in, you know, the nature of reality, and that includes encounters with little people, for instance, or, you know, DMT experiences or magic mushroom experiences. But you could depending on which field of research you come from, you could put them into different categories. So if you're looking at it from a neuroscientific perspective, you'd probably say, well, is there any evidence that, you know, a certain part of your brain lights up when you have one of these encounter experiences? And in which case, you know, you're kind of quite limited in your interpretations. And usually the neuroscientific perspective would just be there to explain away these things as somehow just existing within the brain. And that's why these psychedelic experiences are kind of interested in this regard, because they can help us understand something about the neurobiology, right? But that's only one level of data and explanation. The psychological level, you could look at maybe the kind of underlying psychological conditions or personality types that a person may be predisposed to having one of these experiences. You know, somebody's more of a believer in the paranormal, maybe more likely to have one of these experiences. But again, that doesn't really kind of explain the phenomena. It's just kind of perhaps a bit of a shorthand way of trying to explain it away by saying, oh, you know, if people have a certain personality type, they're more likely to see them. Therefore, you know, it's a delusion, which again is just a kind of it's just a bit of a circular argument, really. And then I guess when you get into more interesting realms, perhaps might be the kind of anthropological and even the folkloric. I'm not a folklorist, but I have dabbled in anthropology, and I guess it's coming from the realm of like para-anthropology, which is the anthropology of the paranormal. You could look at it in different levels. It could be like an experimental approach, which is quite hard to do, or in terms of kind of ethnographic data. So you know, kind of reports of people's experiences. And there's two types of ethnographic data. There's secondhand reports, which like the amazing book by kind of Evans Wentz, where he kind of got firsthand accounts from people in the Celtic nations, mostly of their reports of experiencing seeing little people, or kind of folk tales of people seeing little people. But they're second hand, right? Evans Wentz didn't go out and rummage around in the undergrowth and kind of scrub around on the floor by kind of fairy rings looking for fairies. Well,
I think he would have liked to.
But he would have probably did, but he didn't really report on it.
Yeah.
And so then you have the first-hand accounts, and they typically, although they may not necessarily carry much weight evidentially in the realm of science, they can be the most compelling. So in my experience, you know, I've had encounters with little people in various states of consciousness, and you know, for me, they've been quite compelling experiences. Especially on the few occasions I've had encounter experiences where other people also had the encounter at the same time, which I might get to tell you about. So there's different levels of evidence, and you know, the way we approach data kind of precludes the kind of answers we can get, right? And some approaches are just trying to explain it away, and others might be a bit more open to the interpretation that there is something here that it requires a bit of more open-minded consideration.
Do those academic disciplines, do they ever join forces, if you like, and look from all those different perspectives? I mean, is there forums? Is there ability to meet with sort of parapsychology and psychology and neuro research? Is there a forum for all those disciplines to meet?
Not really. You know, kind of parapsychology is largely outside of the academic kind of mainstream, and is kind of pretty taboo still, actually. And parapsychologists really only deal with the kind of the mechanics of psychic experiences largely, you know, maybe out of body experiences as well, and doesn't really deal with entity encounters per se. But it does shed some important light on it, because it gives us a mean for establishing whether or not, you know, you can access information from some kind of other source beyond yourself, right, through non-normal sensory means. So it could be tapping into, you know, like communication with spirits of the dead is one of the areas parapsychology might look into. And although, you know, they kind of stop short at doing that because of the parapsychological research approach. It shows that, yes, so telepathy and clairvoyance and precognition, accessing information without sensory means, is possible. Therefore, we can't actually ever prove that, you know, you are communicating with some genuine sentient other being, such as a spirit of the dead, or even a pixie, for that matter. Because if psychic abilities are possible, then if you're able to extract some kind of information from this sentient being, and which you didn't know, and which nobody else should have known, and therefore it becomes this kind of unique bit of private information which tells us something, then well, that can just be telepathy or clairvoyance. So like parapsychology actually kind of shuts down some of these explanations about encounters with other beings in some respects. Anyway, going back to your original question, is that parapsychologists are still very much outside the academic mainstream. Some of them are also neuroscientists, but there's not really, they're not really kind of setting up kind of research projects with mainstream neuroscientists and psychologists as such. Although I do try and span all of those realms in my own research. So, but it is difficult, because this whole area is obviously kind of massively underfunded. Unless, of course, you're willing to look at it from a kind of neuro mental health perspective and ask questions about why poor deluded people have these experiences and what kind of psychological kind of problems have they got, and how can you fix that, right? Now, you can get funding for that, but you can't get funding for any research which may be a bit more open-minded.
It's such a shame, though, isn't it? Because the answer's never going to lie in just one area. Academically or otherwise, or religious or spiritually, it's going to come from a cross-pollination of thoughts and ideas, and we're all as human beings looking for similar answers to the meanings of life, etc. And we don't seem to join up in our thinking and in our work to be able to reach a conclusion. It's I find it very strange. I understand why on the funding level, though, why that is. I want to go back. I'm not going to let you sort of talk about your own experiences that briefly with encounters with little people without really digging into that one. One of the things from your perspective that really interests me is I know that you've done a lot of work around psychedelics and lab-based studies into that. And one of the things that I do want to pull out a little bit later on is whether people have different experiences within a lab than they do within more naturalistic environments. But first and foremost, I want to know what you've encountered and how that transpired and what bearing that had on you.
Yeah. So, I mean, I've had all kinds of encounter experiences in various states of consciousness. Like I say, I do a lot of, I've been doing, altered states research, and I've been doing psychedelic research, particularly for decades. And, sometimes I even do research when I'm not on psychedelics, as I always like to joke. So, I've also had the luxury of taking a first person perspective to a lot of that research. Some of it I do a bit more objectively with other people taking, getting into the altered states, but I often also like to go first as well. So, and I spent a lot of time doing kind of anthropological, parapsychological field research in other countries, and, brushing up with indigenous psychedelic using tribes. And I've had the opportunity to get into all kinds of states, you could say, quite literally, often in a state, an altered state. So, I'm beating around the bush a bit here, but so I mean, I guess one of my first encounters, and I've had many encounter experiences, but I'm going to stick to just those with like the little people. Let's call them fairies or pixies or elves or gnomes or dwarves or whatever you want to call them. So one of those encounters was on ayahuasca. Actually, no, my first encounter experience was with DMT, and that was the first ever time I took DMT over 20 years ago now. DMT, and if you don't know, is an extremely potent, short-acting psychedelic, which is naturally occurring in the human body, actually, and it's actually found pretty much everywhere in nature, apart from in fungus. Fungus have their own version. It's called psilocybin, which we get in magic mushrooms. But we have DMT in our body, and if you were to take DMT and smoke it, because you can't actually eat it, it gets broken down by enzymes. If you smoke it, you have an extremely intense, if you have enough, 10-minute mind-bending, life-changing experience. So much so that in a recent survey, I'm talking about the research again, in a recent survey of people who had encounter experiences with DMT, of those that were atheists, less than half of them were atheists after their experience, right? It's like that kind of life-changing 10-minute experience. It's quite astonishing. So my first experience, I had an encounter with these little people who just turned up, and they were basically, I mean, it transports you into this world. You kind of like leave all but the slightest shred of your consciousness behind. You're kind of still vaguely aware of having an ego and a consciousness, but you maybe lost your identity and the sense of where you are. You've no idea where you are. You're not in this world anymore. You're in this kind of world, usually just kind of full of light and energy. And I was kind of thrust into this realm in my first go. And these little beings appeared, like, I would describe them as elves, really. And I wasn't really aware of the kind of elvish folklore around DMT at this point. I didn't really know what DMT was. And these little elves came along and they started getting this kind of huge beam of light, and they were just kind of shoving it inside me into my solar plexus. And it was, it was a kind of very blissful experience. And I kind of came out of it and I was like, oh, yeah, solar plexus. What's it called, a solar plexus? Well, obviously, that's where the light gets in, it's like solar. But, that had quite a profound experience on me. Sometime later, I was in an ayahuasca ceremony. But this time, now the thing is with DMT, you usually have your eyes shut. I mean, it's pitch black anyway, so it wouldn't make any difference. But I had my eyes closed. And in any case, you've no conscious awareness of what's going on around you because you're so far gone. But on the ayahuasca ceremony, I had the occasion of having my eyes open and watching these like little, I'd say pixies, I don't know, little people kind of come marching in through the door of the yurt and kind of walking right in front of me. And I was like totally astonished because I had my eyes open and I could see them in the space between me and the person sat opposite me. And that was a bit too much to handle. It was like I'd just got my head around, having an encounter with them with my eyes closed in my mental space. But here they were just kind of trotting along in front of us. And so I did the sensible thing. I tried to kind of look away, and then they all kind of trotted around in front of me and they were like, ooh, like this. They even kind of kept picking at my hands, and they were holding up my hands and showing me my hands. I don't know why. And I kept trying to turn away, and then they'd kind of drag my hands around and trot around in front of me. So I couldn't really ignore them. But I wanted to, because it was a bit beyond my boggle threshold, really. Mm-hmm. And I've had a few other encounters, but probably the most interesting one since then has been in Brazil. I was organizing a parapsychology conference in Brazil, and just normal kind of academic conference, papers every day. And then every evening we went to see a local group who were going into some kind of altered states journey. And went, ayahuasca with the Indians one night, ayahuasca with a Christian church the next night, a kind of transpossession cult the night after that. And then on the final night, as a bit of a break, because we're all pretty exhausted by this point, we went to see this another local indigenous tribe, the Guarani, who were doing a tobacco ceremony. We thought, okay, that would be a bit less intense than transpossession and a couple of ayahuasca ceremonies of an evening. And also we thought, and all got very, very weird very quickly, and we lost several hours of time trying to get home. they clearly hadn't just given us tobacco, and it took a little bit of time to work out what happened the next morning. But I'm there with my kind of my ex-students, luckily they just graduated, who'd begged me to take them to Brazil, and they were there, and they were like, what happened last night? And I was like, well, I'm not entirely sure. And we all started kind of trying to piece it together like a jigsaw puzzle. And one of my students said, did you see the little man running around the fire in the Indian's hut? And I was like, well, I don't remember. No, I'm not sure I did. And it's like, well, what did he look like? And they were like, well, he was kind of small, really small, about this big. He had big almond-shaped eyes. He looked about 300 years old. And they were like, look, I was like, what, you both saw him? Yeah, this is the interesting thing. So they both seen him, right? And I was like, well, then he must have been there, right? I was like, that's why I thought it was surprising I didn't see him. And they said, look, we even drew a little picture, and they showed me a picture, a very good sketch, like classic, like little wizened old, I don't know, elfin character. And the moment I saw the picture, it just kind of twigged this memory of coming back from the Indian's hut on the minibus, and I'd seen this little wizened old lady about 2 rows of seats in front of me, kind of peering over the seats to the back of the bus, like winking at me like this, conspiratorially. Look, 300 years old with big almond-shaped eyes and a kind of grin from ear to ear, and she was going ooh like this, and I was like, but because I was in this kind of heightened altered state, I was a bit confused, and I thought she was one of the delegates from the conference. And I was like, I don't remember her coming with us on the minibus. I'm trying to kind of like piece it all together. Like, why are you winking at me like that? So that was one of the reasons I realised that the Indians had slipped us some datura on this particular occasion, because it gives you these true hallucinations, so-called, and they're called true hallucinations because on other psychedelics, for instance, you're hallucinating, but with datura, everything just seems completely normal and real. Right? You have no kind of rational sense to say, oh, I'm hallucinating. But there may be more true than that, in the sense that if 3 of you see the same small, wizened, 300-year-old little elf an Indian's kind of tobacco ceremony, then maybe that is a true hallucination in the fact that they maybe genuinely exist. It's hard to find good alternative explanations. So that is probably one of the more compelling experiences I've had.
Absolutely amazing.
That is amazing. I loved hearing that. It's very exotic, David. Whenever I take anything, I'm just sort of lying in my bedroom on my own. You've been around the world and done it. It's that's good. One of the things that has really been interesting me of late, relative to what you're saying, and maybe we can come back to that first person Gnostic experience versus anecdote and surveys. How important that is. But the fundamental difference in experiencing entities on DMT than on other psychedelics, and how the DMT experience differs to much of the not all, but much of the folklore, historic folklore, and modern fairy experiences. I think the most important thing in that regard is, as you've explained so well, you take DMT, however you're taking it, whether it's ayahuasca or injected or smoked it, or however you're taking it, you are in a different reality immediately, as you know. And those entities that you meet in that different reality seem to be in that standalone reality. Whereas other psychedelics, I'm not sure about datura, I've never taken datura, but all the other psychedelics I have taken, everything happens in this reality. You're not blasted into a separate reality from your usual consciousness. Your consciousness on LSD or mushrooms or whatever is radically altered, but you still know, in my case, I still know I'm lying on the bed.
Yeah.
Whereas DMT, you think you're somewhere else. And I just perhaps making that point clear. And the question to you is: are those entities on DMT the same as the ones that may come into this reality, or do you think it's a completely different experience?
Are you saying the entities are on DMT?
Maybe.
I wouldn't be surprised, you know. Yeah, no, I think they are actually a bit different. And you've kind of identified some, you know, kind of good points there. You know, that Indian, absolutely, to reiterate, DMT, you're in this other world. On my ayahuasca experience, which is, you know, ayahuasca contains DMT, and that's the basis of the experience. DMT is like a 10-minute, super intense, fired out of a cosmic cannon kind of experience, whereas ayahuasca is kind of similar in vibe, but, you know, much more prolonged. You're kind of more aware of the fact you're in a room and, you know, there's other people around and so on. So, you know, it's kind of degrees of how dissociated you are. Yes, you're right. And the DMT experience, they are different as well, because that, you know, you're looking at these things and they don't tend to keep still. You know, often they're just kind of formed out of the geometry, the fabric of the experience. So like the whole DMT experience is suffused with this visual perspective of this extremely elaborate, often people describe it as looking like multi-dimensional geometry, which takes on its own sentience, and that so you have this kind of sentient geometry, which then kind of morphs often into these kind of like figures. You know, sometimes they can be humanoid, like little people, you know, and elves are relatively common. Terence McKenna said everybody gets elves. Well, not quite everybody gets elves on DMT. Survey work suggests something in like about 25%. So that, you know, that's not bad. You know, 1 in 4 people get elves, which is pretty common. Okay, so our work kind of was a bit less, but it is different, and so an ayahuasca, I guess that's a bit more like the classic folkloric accounts, except for you are noticeably in an altered state. So there's other stuff going on when you're on an ayahuasca. You know, you may be seeing some of this geometry. It may be very colorful. You may see elves as well, but you're also aware that you are in the room and present with other people. You know, you're still here, and yet you also know you are in an altered state on psychedelics as well. So that's kind of somewhere in between. And yet with Datura, that's another realm altogether, because in fact, other than the hallucinations, everything else seems completely normal. You don't get any geometric colors. There's no kind of colorful patterns to tell you you're in an altered state. The only thing to tell you you're in an altered state is turning around on the minibus and starting a conversation with a werewolf who's just next to you, you know, and you're like, oh wow, I've never met a werewolf before, and yet your rationality is being completely shredded. So for me, I think the Datura experiences, which aren't very well documented, are probably most like the kind of classic spontaneous folkloric encounters with the little people, in that everything else seems apparently quite normal, that these kind of little people just kind of suddenly appear and intrude into your reality. There may be some kind of slip in time, and also then your kind of sense of rationality. There's no kind of suggestion that you're hallucinating. There's just like these things are just there in front of you, and you have to kind of pinch yourself to check, kind of thing, or it's just taken for granted that they're real, which is more the Datura thing. And I guess I think there are some parallels here, because for me, Datura and the related compounds, what they're called the deliriums, are the closest thing to a kind of waking dream experience, right? And I think that's what's going on similarly in the brain and in a dream experience, is that your sense of rationality and questioning is reduced, and your tendency to see curious beings is increased. So could it be that people who are having these spontaneous encounter experiences with no apparent drugs are in a kind of liminal hypnagogic like zone, perhaps? I mean, almost by definition, they are in some kind of altered state, however it occurred, when they have these encounters, I think.
I think that's absolutely spot on. I've written several articles going along that line in relation to the folklore. So the historic folklore, as well as the modern folklore of modern fairy sightings. Often in the folklore, before the encounter actually happens, there will be like a coded hint in the text that the person is feeling different than usual. They will be calmer, relaxed. They might be grieving. They might be uptight and tense and unhappy about something. There's always, and that's, to me, it happens so often in the folklore and in the modern, the historic and the modern folklore. And my suggestion is that these people are in some kind of, at the very least, a meditative, altered state of consciousness when they meet and experience and interact with those entities. I'd say in the historic folklore, that's often overlain with storytelling. You know, the raw example of the experience gets overlain with the storytelling to make a good tale. That's less so in modern fairy encounters. You know, Kate and I have talked before about the Fairy Investigation Society's census, which you know, I think you know about, David, carried out a few years ago, about 500 experiences, and they are much more raw experiences. But once again, you will often note, and I'd say over 80% of the cases, that people were feeling differently than their everyday reality. And I think that's perhaps just enough in certain people to make whatever chemical changes in the brain. It might even induce an endogenous DMT release, wherever DMT is released from, because we don't know, do we?
Yeah.
But that, you know, it's a possibility. I know in the alien abduction experiences, there's a lot of people talking about, well, this is a DMT experience. You're somehow the DMT's flooding your brain and you're having this abduction experience. And of course, there are lots of similarities between alien abduction reports, the folklore, and modern fairy sightings to a certain degree. Yeah, that's you know, it's you know, I think that's an incredibly important point.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I totally agree. And I think it's kind of like, which comes first though? Is it a bit of a chicken and the egg? It's like, you know, by seeing these things, I mean, if you see these things, it's going to induce a kind of altered state anyway, right? It's like the kind of the sense of awe and amazement and like, what's going on? We're not in Kansas anymore. Or, you know, is it kind of preempted a little bit by you're already in a slight kind of altered state, and then that allows you to have this experience? So it's, I don't know, really, it's a bit of a chicken and the egg. I guess it's kind of like seeing and believing and seeing. You know, it's like seeing is believing, but believing is also seeing. It's like, you know, once you actually see these things, it's going to change your whole perception, right? If you're open enough to have that experience, it's going to put you in this altered state.
That is such an important point. That Gnostic direct experiencing will change you if it's done at a psychedelic level. It always does, doesn't it? Yeah. And it may make you prone to maybe exaggerate things that you previously believed. But if you're just reading survey reports and you're reading other people's anecdotes, and I know the plural of anecdote is data, but you can read as much as you like. But when it first happens to you and then it happens again, you just know. You just know that exists, and that's a difficult thing to get across because for a start, even though you're lucidly describing your own experiences, they are actually ineffable, aren't they? You cannot bring back what really happened. And so, of course, when whatever you want to call them, a reductionist, materialist, non-believer says, well, explain the experience to me, they will just simply be able to tell you it's an hallucination.
Yeah.
Your brain is hallucinating this for whatever reason. There is no standalone separate reality, and there is no such thing as non-human intelligent entities. And you will I found it very difficult to get past that barrier, even though, you know, I know what went on, but I can't explain it to you. Do you find that at all, David?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, in my experience as a psychologist, I think historically, and it's not as bad as it was, I don't think, but you know, that is always the go-to. It's like you're between a rock and a hard place, aren't you? If you kind of talk about these things in any kind of serious way, you know, you're thought to be delusional because these experiences are hallucinations. But this word hallucination has been thrown around like this kind of massive catch-all rubbish dump. It's like anything which doesn't fit into ordinary consensus reality is called a hallucination by definition. And because it's an hallucination, we don't have to explain it. It's just like, oh, you were hallucinating. Your brain was doing some weird stuff. Just ignore that.
Or fund any research into it.
Exactly. Well, yeah, exactly. Unless you're looking at why people are delusional and having hallucinations, or believing they're hallucinations, which is a delusion, right? So it's one thing to have a hallucination. Everybody has hallucinations at some point, but when you start to kind of go, oh, well, that was actually possibly real, or it was real, then it's like, okay, that's where you kind of start getting pathologized, and nobody wants that, right? So, but it has a powerful effect and force on people in self-censoring their experiences, which means that these things aren't talked about openly as much. I find myself in the kind of privileged position of being a parapsychologist for decades, is that everybody tells you their story, right? And everybody's got one, even the most kind of like seemingly materialist reductionist, hardcore scientist thinking person. They're like, oh, I've never told anyone this before, because everyone would think I was mad, but you would understand. And then they're going to tell you their story. So yeah, this term hallucination needs unpacking, and I think there is some research now. We started to look into kind of consciousness. I mean, until like 15, 20 years ago, consciousness itself was a dirty word in the academy. You couldn't even study consciousness. You couldn't even mention consciousness. It's like subjective experience is like, no, we get it out. You get thrown out of the academy. And luckily with neuroscience, it's like consciousness now is something interesting to study. And that has kind of, and then also psychedelics, because these are kind of like this amazing spotlight on consciousness. And consequently, people have had to be a bit more sophisticated about how they consider hallucinatory experiences. We have to kind of start to break them down and categorize them. And, not all hallucinations are alike. We can maybe understand them. Maybe we could even consider them at face value without just saying you're a path, you're psychotic or deluded or something. So I think this is starting to happen, but it does take time.
Can I jump back, because it's something that I definitely want to unpick is you were saying that when people are on DMT experiences that they do experience elves, or that's how they're described. So the first question is, are they describing the same beings when you get descriptors from them? And secondly, have they any previous predisposition to fairy folklore or animistic type beliefs before they actually go into and enter these altered states of being?
Well, that's the $1 million question, really. I mean, it could probably cost you more than that to actually get to the bottom of it. But yeah, so this is one of the arguments, okay, against the possible reality of discarnate entities encountered in whatever state of being, is like that there's a kind of cultural relativism to it, like a cultural constructivism. That's the kind of position, is that we can't ever get away from our cultural influences. So we don't even know whether or not nobody's even particularly explored it. And it'd be worthwhile doing some research on this. How much exposure have you had to kind of fairy folklore or kind of Terence McKenna's kind of raps about DMT elves, right, prior to your experience? You could probably kind of measure that in some way, but it's not really been explored. But it is kind of taken as a given that you can never really get away from that, and you can never really know that you can't be certain that a person hasn't been exposed to the lore, the folklore around the association between DMT and elves, for instance. But what you can do is what myself and Andrew Gallimore tried to do, is go back to the very first DMT reports, right? And say, well, before there was any folklore associated with these experiences, can we look at those encounter experiences and what did they contain? And sure enough, they contained encounters with little people, not just, but you get the whole pantheon of DMT entities, but you get little people as well. So they were there from the beginning. It's not like they are a cultural insertion, but you can't be sure that people having them later on are having them as a kind of raw encounter, or because of their cultural kind of precedents, something they've read or something they've thought about. So this is a really good question. And at one point there was this kind of a kind of urban myth floating around that in the 1960s or 70s that somebody had taken ayahuasca and given it to Eskimos in the north of kind of Canada. And the classic thing with ayahuasca is you get like kind of encounters with serpents and jaguars, and they said the Eskimos were having visions of serpents and jaguars, right? But that experiment never actually happened. It was just this kind of urban myth that somebody traced back to Berkeley, but there's no documented account of the research ever happened. It's a great idea, but it never happened. So it's kind of almost an impossible question. But a question we're interested in. So myself and colleagues have been trying to map the DMT experiences, looking at the phenomenology, looking at the kind of prevalence of encounters, trying to find commonalities, trying to map the kind of the flora, fauna, and fungi of this kind of DMT otherworld, and how common are elves, how common are praying mantises doing kind of strange brain operations on people. They seem to pop up a lot,
Really?
Yeah, it's very weird. And as you also find in the alien abduction literature, is that a cultural meme, or is it something inherent to the experience? One thing we can say though is that in terms of people's prior cultural prejudices or kind of information they've been exposed to, that this whole thing about prior metaphysical beliefs, right? We can say that, okay, people who were atheists before, it's like they didn't believe in anything of this kind of spiritual stuff or entities or beings, and yet it had a deeply profound kind of metaphysical reorientation effect on more than half of them, right? So it's like those kinds of things you can say, well, there's something extremely profound about these experiences. But it's hard to say if they're,
And on the back of that, I mean, that's a huge proportion data-wise of people who go from non-believing into, absolutely, the world is open to them. After they've had those experiences, I'm sure you do follow up, but do they have, and I don't mean sort of, post trip experiences, but do they then have other paranormal or spiritual experiences that occur without taking psychedelics DMT that they didn't experience before then? Do they encounter different things after that initial experience?
Well, that's a really good question as well. I mean, there's no data on that particular sample. That was from a kind of large-scale survey, particularly just looking at DMT entity encounters. But there is some kind of extant data to show that people have had psychedelic experiences, for instance, will tend to have more kind of paranormal-like experiences. Yeah, more entity encounter experiences, more ESP experiences, more psychic episodes. Same thing we get with like near-death experiences, right? People have spontaneous near-death experiences or supposedly alien abduction experiences, right? And in fact, what we might categorize all these experiences under the heading of exceptional human experience. Any experience which kind of makes you question the nature of reality from your experience, where you have a kind of cognitive dissonance with what you thought was reality with what you think might be reality now. All those experiences tend to increase people's, experiences of a paranormal like nature afterwards. It kind of changes people. Usually, they tend to have more psychic experiences and so on. So yeah.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think people, is it neurological? Is it chemical reaction? What do you think's going off when that occurs?
Well, I'm a psychologist, so I kind of tend to look at these things on a kind of psychological level. I mean, there may be some kind of neurological changes, and but that only gives you a kind of neurological level of explanation to the end result. But I think we could say it makes people more open to these experiences, and I think that could be on a functional level in terms of just like basic belief systems, all the way up to a kind of biological level. It could actually have some kind of anatomical changes in the brain. but like I say, it's kind of this experience of, you know, this kind of interplay between believing and perceiving. Like if you have an experience which challenges your belief systems, then it suddenly makes you more open. It breaks down your kind of rigidity around your beliefs and makes you more open to later experiences, looking at it on a kind of psychological level. And that's the kind of level explanation I feel most comfortable with. So
yeah, I think that, yeah, no, I think that's absolutely spot on. And you just reminded me of, well, you can't talk about DMT without talking about that. And obviously you know all about it, but for anyone watching who doesn't know, the DMT, the spirit molecule, as the book was called, was the sort of the full publication of Dr. Rick Strassman's study of DMT and about 60 patients. I think I'm getting that right, in New Mexico in the 90s. And there's lots of examples there of people who went through the program, and then there was a sort of catch up a year later, and their lives have transformed, and they're much more spiritual, they're kinder, they're more generous, that, you know, these kind of things. And you do get some of the surveys I've seen, including your own work, David, sometimes you'll get little snippets of people saying this, not quite as much as for the near-death experience, which seems to be sort of 100%, but it's definitely there. And it's even there again in the folklore. And actually in the folklore it works both ways. Sometimes the person who's fallen into a fairy ring, or there's a classic story of Anne Jeffries in the 17th century, who was a domestic servant in a big house, who probably had temporal lobe epilepsy, but she had an amazing experience, very DMT like experience, and when she came back she was a healer. She became a healer, and there's lots of apparently genuine records of her healing people. The other way it goes in folklore sometimes is that you go into a fairy ring and you come back out and you become so depressed about being back in, you know, this reality after experience it, that you just wither away and die.
Wow.
So it does work both ways in the folklore, but I found most modern experiences there's definitely a change. A large percentage of people are changed for the better, more spiritually, more kind, more, it's very noticeable.
It's hard to beat Tir na Nog, isn't it, really? I mean,
well, why would you want to come back to this, you know?
I mean, it's totally parallels, and yeah, for the most part, people who have exceptional experiences of whatever variety, but you know, I'd say the near-death experience is the kind of like the epitome of this. Is like they come back changed, that they're much more kind of pro-life, they're much more kind of joyous, they're much more kind of humane and humanitarian, have deeper empathy, and also kind of like tend to report more psychic experiences, the more kind of ecologically conscious, etc. And we find the same thing with psychedelic experiences, mystical experiences with psychedelics, or exceptional experiences, not quite to the same extent, but you know, depending on the intensity of the experience, but they can be extremely profound. I think that goes across the whole board. And why not? Of course, with entity encounters, and I love that it's in the kind of classic folkloric studies. Although curiously, I like that people pine for Tir na Nog and just wither away.
Yeah,
it's a bit like Wandering Angus, isn't it? You know.
Yes. Yeah. In some ways, that's, you know, what we were talking about earlier on. That's an overlay of storytelling onto whatever actually happened. But I've noticed, looking at the folklore, if you keep seeing the same motifs, they're trying to tell you something. And you know, you need to sort of dig under all of that overlay and get to the core of the experience.
Wonderful.
I've got a big question. It's probably slightly off track from fairyland. I have come across my fair share of parapsychologists. Nothing against you, do like you all. But one of the things that fascinates me about parapsychology, and I have tentatively studied it in a roundabout way, is what constitutes as proof?
I guess that's a very good question, and of course parapsychologists do their damnedest to be as hardcore scientists as they can. In fact, parapsychologists have pioneered a lot of the kind of cutting edge scientific methods, particularly within psychology, by being open to so much criticism that they've been the one that have been the most rigorous methodologically. So I think parapsychologists have had some of the most stringent kind of bars for what we accept as good evidence. But it's usually of a very scientific nature. So that is kind of like rigorously controlled, well conducted experimental data that is kind of like statistically highly improbable in favor of the evidence of ESP, particularly psychedelics, particularly kind of telepathy, clairvoyance, and precognition has been the main, that's been the kind of the bread and butter of parapsychological research for decades. But that, at the end of the day, it becomes a numbers game, because the only thing you can have any certainty in is you can't even have any certainty in probability, but you can have a degree of certainty that your results are so improbable that you can't explain it by any of the other means. And in fact, the whole of science is kind of held up by this yardstick of improbability. It's like there's no facts in science. There's only you only get proofs. A proof of anything. You always see these kind of headlines: scientists prove such and such. It's so nonsense. Scientists never prove anything. You only get proof in maths, logic, and baking. Oh, and whiskey as well. Right? You don't get it in science. It's just like we have a degree of certainty based on the improbability of our findings that it can't be due to chance. That's all we can say. And so parapsychologists have been kind of drilled this, in a really kind of heavy way. And really kind of stick to that parameter.
So in directly related to that, and just moving back to DMT and how we get the data that we do. Obviously, you've written several papers on the subject of studies and surveys of people. There's a recent one by Johns Hopkins University, isn't there? Last year, I think that was.
Yeah.
And there's Peter Mayer's stuff, John Hanna's survey recording. But it's all, I find this is why Rick Strassman's study, I think, is still unique, isn't it? In that a group of people were got together with the specific aim of injecting them with DMT and recording their experiences. All of the other evidence comes from survey reports. I think this is quite important when you're trying to get to the bottom of what maybe these entities are and how we experience them, interact with them, because in the survey reports will obviously be written sometime, days, weeks, years after the event. And then you have to factor in all of the memory slips. And is that how it was, or as close as you can get to it? Whereas in Strassman's study, he was onto them the moment they came round from the trip, so you're more likely to get a more direct, almost like waking up from a dream. Try and remember a dream 7 days ago, and you might have a hazy idea of it. Remember it the moment you wake up, and boom. So that's a very long way of asking you, David. Do you think another Strassman style study will happen in the near future?
It's already underway. I mean, actually, there's a couple of studies. One is at Imperial, who I collaborate with. Chris Timmerman has been leading that study using brain imaging, but also asking people about their experiences, and interviewing them about their entity encounters and so on. And he's done 2 phases of that study, and they're now doing a 3rd phase where they're actually keeping people in the DMT state for a prolonged period of time. It's called like DMTX, this kind of extended state. I mean, they're mostly interested in the neuroscientific stuff, but they're also looking at phenomenology, and they're trying to map the 2 together. And then our study, which we've been doing at Greenwich, which is a field DMT study, it's very similar to the lab-based research, except for we've got a bit more of a free hand, and it doesn't cost as much. We don't need kind of licenses to give people DMT. We just go around to people's houses when they're taking DMT, and we do our experiments with them.
Do you tell them you're going round to the house before you turn up?
Sometimes, yeah. So we actually pay a lot of attention to, like, maintaining their anonymity and identity and the rest of it, because they're basically engaging in illegal activity. So we don't tell them, we don't even know where they live, for instance. You know, they come and meet us. It's very clandestine. They come and meet us somewhere. They give us a pseudonym and they take us to a place, and we don't record any of the details of who they are or where they live, just in case, you know. It's all very exciting and clandestine. And we've been able to do this experiment. We've had over 40 sessions with nearly 40 participants. And we've been looking at a few interesting things. So obviously we interview them immediately about their experience with a particular focus on their entity encounters. But we've also had the opportunity to do some experiments with precognition, so them getting access to information from the future, which they couldn't by any kind of inference, under experimentally controlled conditions. We've had some really nice results with that. We've done tried out a few telepathy experiments just to test the protocol. We don't have enough data to make any conclusions about that. And what we have done, which we're in the process of analyzing, is having people go at the same time and looking to see if they have shared experiences, because this is one of the things that people report, you know, like my experience with my students on Datura. People on ayahuasca particularly, and other psychedelics, talk about having an experience where they're in this kind of other world, they're in this visionary world, and then they see their mate or somebody sat opposite them or whatever, and then they kind of have a, you know, ooh, and then they kind of chat to them afterwards, and they're like, they seem to have been in the same place. So we're trying to kind of test that experimentally for the first ever time, with a kind of keeping an eye on the kind of entities they encounter. And so we've had 10 pairs of people who went at the same time. So we've got 20 trip reports, which we're going to compare to 20 people who had a solo experience. And we're going to get independent judges to look at these accounts and try and say whether this was a kind of shared experience or a solo experience. Or actually what we're going to do is we're going to give them a trip report from somebody who had a shared experience, possibly, or somebody who's on their own. And then they give them 2 other trip reports, and they have to say which one it's most like. And we're going to repeat this process for all the possible combinations. And then we can quantify, you know, this was like, people were more often reported that these experiences were similar than these experiences.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. What's the sort of time scale? When do you plan to finish and make that a publication?
Well, I had a big hiatus because of pandemic and homeschooling and God knows what other personal issues, but emergency operations. And anyway, but we're back on track again. And so we're going to have to design, we're kind of building some software so we can present these trip reports to people in a completely blind and independent way, which is unbiased. And so people can give a very honest kind of quantifiable response, right? So we've got to run it past maybe 100 independent judges. But looking at the data ourselves, when we're collecting this data, it was quite, I would say on a subjective level, it was like, oh my God, you know, we've got people to we interviewed them and they also made sketches of their experience. So what we do is, as soon as they come out of this other world, as soon as somebody kind of goes, yeah, I'm back, we kind of go, okay, and we take them off to another room. So we separate them out so they can't communicate with each other. And we interview them separately, you know, 2 interviewers, and they draw a sketch. And the stuff they were coming up with had quite an interesting degree of correspondence on a subjective level. You look at them and you go, oh my God. So we actually didn't think this was going to work, but now I'm thinking maybe this can work, you know. So they set the intention of having this kind of shared experience. And yeah, it's interesting to say. I mean, obviously we can't say it's anything more than just telepathy, even if we do get a result, but that's kind of interesting in and of itself.
Yeah.
That's I mean, that going back to the shared experience that you talked about at the beginning and what you're studying now, and I know what you've just said about there's no such thing as proof, but shared experiences does get you a little further down the line to the truth or some kind of definitive-ish proof. And that's again the same. You know, I know I keep saying that's the same as the folklore, but it is. There are lots of stories of different people in both, again, historical folklore and modern folklore, different people experiencing the same thing. Now, that has got to, as long as they're being honest, they're not deluded, they're not, you're not making it up, there's not some other variable at play, that certainly does suggest that there is an objective reality to that particular entity, whatever that objective reality is, and whether it's in our reality or we've gone into their reality. I find this incredibly, I'm writing a piece on it now, so this is all grist to the mill.
Bless. Listen, guys,
it certainly moves the argument along.
Say again.
It does.
So
go on, Kate. Sorry.
No, I was just about to say we're coming up to time, and I know that I am really bad at rolling well over people's time limits, because things get interesting, and there are so many things that I certainly could have explored for, a good hour on their own. And I know that Neil will probably feel exactly the same way, that we could sit and talk for hours and hours and hours. But I realise that people have to, be human and go and get something to eat and tend to things domestically and whatever you. Before we go though, David, where can people find out more about you and the work that you've been doing? And because I know that people are going to have a million and one questions about this. I know that when you're on Victor Wins, there were reams of questions coming up about, and usually, can we come and be a research guinea pig? I'm not going to do that to you. I'm not going to say, can I come and do the research for you? Anyway, so where can people find you, and how can people learn more?
Yeah, so you can look me up on the University of Greenwich. I've got a website on there. I've got a page on there, but all of my papers and talks and all the rest of it are all online on academia.edu, which is a kind of generic site for academics, under David Luke. And I've dropped the actual link in there if you want to use it. So
yeah, brilliant.
Hopefully you can find all my stuff on there.
Yeah, and on Amazon, I was searching your books today, and definitely a couple that will have to. And there was an explosion of other books from other people that came from your search that I am now going to be skint by the end of the evening. Absolutely skint. So I want to thank you so much. It's honestly, I this is one of those ones that I could talk and listen and what have you for hours. So thank you so much for giving up your time and coming to talk to us both, Hare and the Hawthorn. And yeah, thank you so much. It's been super interesting.
Yeah, thank you, David.
So much. Actually, likewise. This is one of my favourite topics. So thank you so much. Really great to chat to you both.
Bless you. Okay, then. Speak to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.